Welcome back. Tonight, we turn our gaze toward the hidden corridors of power, where silence carried more weight than swords. The Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, have been called saints, scholars, spies, and even assassins. They wore black robes, but their reach stretched across empires. Behind cathedral walls and inside royal courts, their influence was whispered about with awe and with fear. This isn't a tale of simple devotion. It's a story where faith and power walk hand in hand, where education could enlighten or control, and where secrets sometimes outlived the men who kept them. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into history's shadows, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Together, we make a constellation across time zones. There are moments in history when silence seems louder than thunder. The halls of the Vatican, with their marble floors and golden altars, have often been thought of as the center of faith and devotion. Yet behind that beauty, another story unfolds, one much darker. For centuries, a certain order of priests was both trusted and feared. They were not kings, yet kings listened to them. They did not ride into battle with banners, yet their presence could shape the fate of nations. They were the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. Founded in the early 16th century by a former soldier who turned his wounds into a vision, the order carried with it a reputation unlike any other. To some, they were missionaries, spreading education and salvation. To others, they were agents of control, moving quietly through courts and kingdoms. The power they held came not from swords or crowns, but from obedience, knowledge, and influence. They whispered in confessionals, they taught in schools, and they traveled farther than most armies ever could. Rumors began to follow them. Stories of manipulation, sudden deaths, and networks of information that seemed too vast to be chance. Whether true or exaggerated, those whispers have never truly faded. The Jesuits are remembered as saints by some, but by others as shadows who walked just behind the throne. And it is in that uneasy space between devotion and power that their true story lies. Ignatius of Loyola was not born a saint. He first lived as a soldier in service to the Spanish crown, seeking honor, women, and the thrill of battle. In 1521, during the defense of Pamplona against French forces, a cannonball shattered his leg. The injury was devastating, leaving him bedridden for months in his family's castle. His old desires for stories of knights and romances were denied to him, as the only books available were religious texts about the lives of Christ and the saints. At first, he read them with reluctance, but slowly something began to stir. The soldier who once dreamed of worldly glory now found himself drawn to visions of spiritual battle. Accounts suggest that he experienced vivid moments that felt beyond dreams, powerful images of angels, the Virgin Mary, and Christ. Some claimed it was madness brought on by pain, but to Ignatius it was revelation. He began to see the struggle not as one fought with swords, but as one within the soul itself. He spent nights weeping, fearful of the man he had been, yet hopeful for the man he might become. His writings during this time reveal a mind torn between pride and surrender, ambition and obedience. Out of the silence of his long recovery grew the resolve to abandon armor, to walk barefoot, to embrace poverty and penance. What began as defeat on the battlefield became the seed of an order that would change history. His transformation was not gentle or easy, but it marked the beginning of a mission that would eventually lead to the founding of the Society of Jesus, a brotherhood unlike any that had come before it. When Ignatius finally rose from his sickbed, he was not the same man who had once carried a sword. He walked away from his family's castle with a limp and a new purpose that burned far deeper than his old desire for glory. He left behind silks and armor, dressing instead in plain clothes, carrying nothing but a staff and a small bag. For months he wandered the roads of Spain, sleeping in caves, fasting until his body trembled, and whipping himself in acts of penance that he believed would strip away his pride. He prayed for hours in silence, convinced that only through suffering could he draw nearer to God. His journey eventually carried him to Paris, where he studied alongside some of the brightest young men of the age. Unlike other students, Ignatius was not there for comfort or reputation. He carried with him a vision. One by one, he drew others to his side, not with wealth or power, but through his intensity and the conviction that God demanded more than casual devotion. These men became his companions, each agreeing to a life of discipline and service. Together, they pledged themselves not just to poverty and chastity, but to an obedience unlike anything seen before. Their loyalty would be directed entirely to the Pope, with no hesitation, no questioning, no delay. This was the beginning of something new, something sharper than any monastic order that had come before. Ignatius had once been a soldier of Spain. Now, he and his companions prepared to become soldiers of the Church, willing to go wherever they were sent, willing to do whatever was asked. Their brotherhood would be known as the Society of Jesus. The Society of Jesus was unlike anything the Catholic world had seen before. Other religious orders lived apart from society in cloisters and monasteries, devoting their days to prayer and silence. The men who followed Ignatius entered the world instead, stepping into classrooms, palaces, and marketplaces. Their vow of obedience to the Pope meant they could be dispatched at a moment's notice to any land on earth, and they obeyed without hesitation. They became teachers, confessors, scientists, and advisors. They studied languages with astonishing speed, immersing themselves in local customs so completely that they could pass as natives. In courts of kings and queens, they appeared as trusted guides, and in distant villages, they appeared as humble missionaries. But behind these roles lay something more, a network that seemed to stretch like invisible threads across continents. Each Jesuit was trained to write reports, long and detailed, about the lands they visited, the rulers they met, the secrets they heard. These reports traveled back to Rome, building a body of knowledge that surpassed what any empire or crown could gather. It was intelligence disguised as piety. Their ability to gather information, to analyze, and to influence without appearing threatening set them apart from all others. Some celebrated them as brilliant educators who gave opportunities to the poor and raised up leaders for the future. Others feared them as hidden agents who listened too closely and whispered too quietly. It was in this dual image that their reputation grew, both admired and mistrusted. The Jesuits did not carry weapons, but they carried something far more dangerous. They carried knowledge, and knowledge was a weapon no one could see coming. The reach of the Jesuits spread quickly. Within only a short time of their founding, they had established schools across Europe and missions that carried them to the far corners of the known world. In their schools, they trained not only priests, but also the sons of nobles and rulers. These young men grew into generals, judges, and kings who never forgot the lessons of their Jesuit tutors. Education became their most powerful tool. They did not simply teach prayers and scripture. They taught mathematics, astronomy, history, and languages. They taught their students how to argue with precision, how to speak persuasively, and how to lead. In the missions beyond Europe, they moved with equal skill. They dressed as scholars in Japan, as astronomers in China, as philosophers in India. They did not try to force their way in with soldiers. Instead, they adapted, listening carefully, blending into cultures, earning trust. Yet always they sent reports back to Rome. These reports contained not only accounts of baptisms and conversions, but detailed notes on political alliances, trade routes, geography, and the strengths and weaknesses of kingdoms. In this way, the Jesuits created what was perhaps the most effective intelligence system of their time. Monarchs began to notice how well informed they were, how quickly they seemed to know events before others did. For some rulers, this was a comfort. For others, it was a source of unease. Were the Jesuits truly missionaries? Or were they something else? A quiet army without swords, carrying influence instead of steel. Wherever they appeared, suspicion was never far behind. Whispers began to follow the Jesuits wherever they went. In the palaces of Europe, ministers wondered how these priests always seemed to be present when decisions were made. In universities, scholars noted how their students grew into leaders who thought in remarkably similar ways. Even in distant lands, the Jesuits seemed able to move with uncanny ease, appearing in courts, gathering knowledge, and shaping opinion without drawing attention. Their vow of obedience to the Pope made them unique, for their loyalty was not to any crown or nation, but to one man in Rome. This made them trusted allies of the papacy, but it also made them dangerous in the eyes of kings. How could a monarch fully trust an advisor who served another master above him? Confessionals deepened the suspicion. Rulers poured their hearts out to Jesuit confessors, revealing fears, ambitions, and secrets. In the quiet of those booths, truths were spoken that could topple governments or influence wars. Whether the Jesuits ever used this knowledge directly or not, the mere possibility left monarchs uneasy. Stories began to spread of sudden illnesses, of rivals disappearing, of letters vanishing or appearing at convenient times. None of it was proven, yet the pattern was hard to ignore. The Jesuits denied all accusations, insisting their mission was only to serve God and the Church. But silence can be as powerful as words. In their silence, suspicion grew, and the question lingered like a shadow. Were these men holy servants, or were they the hidden hand guiding the politics of nations? The structure of the Jesuit order was another source of fascination and fear. Unlike other religious communities that emphasized prayer in solitude or simple living in monasteries, the Jesuits organized themselves more like an army. At the top stood the superior general, a man whose authority over the order was absolute. He was elected for life, and his decisions could not be challenged by any ordinary member. Beneath him stretched a chain of command as precise as that of a military. Provinces were led by provincials, colleges by rectors, and novices by masters who shaped the next generation with discipline and scrutiny. Every Jesuit was expected to submit to his superiors without hesitation, carrying out orders instantly and completely. Reports flowed upward constantly. Letters were written, evaluated, and preserved, creating a web of communication that bound the order together, across continents. This design gave the Jesuits a level of coordination that no other religious body possessed. They could move quickly, adapt to events, and respond with unity. To their supporters, this efficiency was proof of their devotion and brilliance. To their enemies, it looked like the machinery of a hidden empire operating within the church itself. The title given to their leader reflected this unease. He was often called the Black Pope, not because he wore a crown or lived in splendor, but because his authority stretched quietly into corners of the world that even the white-robed Pope could not easily reach. It was this mixture of secrecy, discipline, and obedience that fed the legend of the Jesuits as shadows moving just behind the visible power of the Vatican. Education soon became the sharpest weapon of the Jesuits. From the very beginning, they poured their energy into founding schools, not hidden in remote valleys, but in the heart of cities where influence gathered. Their classrooms were different from most of their age. They did not limit lessons to Latin or the Catechism. They taught philosophy, science, literature, mathematics, and music. They trained students to think logically, to speak with elegance, and to debate with confidence. Kings and nobles sent their sons to Jesuit colleges, trusting that these priests could mold them into capable leaders. For the gifted poor, Jesuit schools opened doors that had previously been locked tight. In both cases, the Society of Jesus shaped minds that would go on to hold power. Generations of judges, generals, ministers, and even future popes passed through Jesuit hands. This created a quiet form of loyalty, not enforced by threat, but built through gratitude and admiration. Students who had once sat in their classrooms later stood in positions of authority, carrying the imprint of Jesuit logic with them. Some saw this as a great blessing, a gift of knowledge to the world. Others saw something more deliberate, a method of guiding the future without ever sitting on thrones. The Jesuits did not need to command armies when they could shape the commanders before they ever wore a uniform. With chalk instead of swords, with books instead of banners, they influenced the direction of nations. For supporters, it was brilliance. For critics, it was manipulation on a scale too subtle to resist. Either way, the world began to notice that wherever power gathered, Jesuit-trained minds were never far away. It was not only in schools and missions that the Jesuits gained influence. They became confessors to the most powerful rulers of Europe, sitting in darkened chapels where kings and queens whispered their sins and secrets. In the intimacy of confession, even the proudest monarch became vulnerable. Jesuits were trained listeners, careful not only to absolve, but also to observe, storing away details that revealed fears, ambitions, and alliances. Whether they used this knowledge for politics or kept it purely for spiritual purposes remains a matter of debate. Yet the very possibility unsettled courts across the continent. Rivals of the order accused them of guiding rulers with whispers, of planting ideas that could shape treaties, fuel wars, or topple ministers. Some even believed entire shifts in policy could be traced back to a single conversation between a Jesuit and a sovereign. Their critics warned that this was power too great for any priest to hold, especially one bound by a vow of obedience, not to the throne, but to Rome. Yet rulers continue to seek them out, drawn by their intellect, their patience, and their aura of incorruptibility. To confess to a Jesuit was to place one's soul in their hands, and once that trust was given, it was nearly impossible to take back. The court may have glittered with wealth and intrigue, but in the quiet of the confessional booth, the Jesuit had a power greater than crowns, the power to know a ruler's heart. The Jesuit missions beyond Europe carried an equally complex legacy. In Asia, they gained access not through force but through learning. In China, they impressed emperors by mastering astronomy and mathematics, offering precise calendars that gave rulers authority over time itself. In Japan, they dressed as scholars and blended into the rhythms of local life, gaining a foothold where few outsiders could survive. In India, they debated philosophers and studied ancient texts, winning respect by meeting wisdom with wisdom. On the surface, these missions were about spreading faith, but beneath the surface, they also mapped lands, cataloged trade routes, and sent back observations about the strengths and weaknesses of kingdoms. In the Americas, their influence was even more visible. They built reductions, settlements where native peoples were gathered, taught, baptized, and kept apart from outside traders and soldiers. To some, these missions offered protection from conquest. To others, they were cages that erased old traditions and languages. Whether in forests, deserts, or royal palaces, the Jesuits moved like shadows, learning, teaching, and recording. Their letters to Rome became some of the most detailed reports on the world that existed, filled with knowledge of resources, customs, and politics that could be used for purposes far beyond salvation. This dual role blurred the line between missionary and spy, leaving later generations to wonder whether the cross they carried was also a mask for something larger. The Jesuits themselves insisted they only served the church, yet their presence in so many courts and kingdoms told another story, one of quiet influence spreading across the map of the world. The knowledge gathered by the Jesuits during their travels was astonishing in its scope. Their letters back to Europe were more than spiritual accounts. They described rivers that had never appeared on maps, mountains no European had ever crossed, and cities filled with customs and beliefs unfamiliar to the West. They wrote about markets bustling with goods that could shift economies, about languages that shaped thought in ways Latin never could, about courts where loyalty shifted like the wind. These reports were copied, translated, and stored in archives, turning the Society of Jesus into an unofficial intelligence service centuries before the word existed. Even monarchs sometimes relied on Jesuit information to guide diplomacy or trade. Yet the reports did not merely describe, they analyzed. Jesuits were trained to see patterns, to understand motives, and to record them with precision. Their writings revealed not only what was happening, but what might happen next. This predictive quality gave Rome a unique advantage, a sense of foresight that unsettled governments who suspected the Vatican of knowing more than it should. Critics argued that the Jesuits were building a secret empire of knowledge, a hidden library of facts and strategies that could be used to influence nations without ever raising a sword. Supporters countered that they were simply scholars who loved truth and wanted to share what they discovered, but the truth lay somewhere in the uneasy silence between the two. The Jesuits understood that information was power, and they held more of it than almost anyone else. To those who trusted them, it was a gift. To those who feared them, it was a threat. Either way, their letters became one of the most valuable weapons the order ever possessed. The growing suspicion of governments was not without reason. Rulers began to notice how swiftly the Jesuits adapted, how quickly they gained access to places where even ambassadors struggled to enter. In one court, they were confessors. In another, they were tutors to princes. And in still another, they advised queens on matters of conscience and policy. Their ability to learn languages with remarkable speed only deepened the impression that they were not ordinary priests. They could blend into local cultures so effectively that outsiders often mistook them for natives. This talent made them invaluable as missionaries. Yet it also made them perfect observers. When they wrote back to Rome, their reports contained not only details of conversions, but also lists of allies, tensions between rulers, and descriptions of armies. To some kings, this was too much power in the hands of men whose loyalty belonged elsewhere. There were whispers of forged documents, of letters that shifted alliances, of advice whispered in royal ears that led to treaties or wars. None of it could be proven, but the pattern of their presence was undeniable. Whenever a significant change occurred in a kingdom, it seemed a Jesuit had been nearby. Whether they were guiding events or merely watching them unfold, their proximity to power became impossible to ignore. The silence of the order only added to the mystery. They did not explain, they did not defend, they simply carried on with calm confidence. This left their enemies to wonder if, behind the black robes, lay not only scholars and missionaries, but strategists shaping history itself, one quiet word at a time. As their influence deepened, so too did the unease surrounding their mysterious fourth vow. Most religious orders promised three things: poverty, chastity, and obedience. The Jesuits, however, added another, a vow of absolute loyalty to the Pope. This was not symbolic, nor was it a matter of general obedience to the Church. It was personal, direct, and total. A Jesuit swore to obey the Pope instantly and without hesitation, even if it meant leaving his country that very night, traveling in disguise, or taking on a task that blurred the line between priest and agent. This vow gave the Pope what appeared to be a personal army, a network of men who would go anywhere and do anything on command. To admirers, it was the highest expression of devotion, a spiritual readiness to serve God's representative on earth. To critics, it was terrifying. What would happen if such power was used not for faith, but for politics? If Jesuits obeyed the Pope without question, then their conscience was no longer their own. They could be sent to influence kings, infiltrate universities, or even silence opponents under the justification of divine order. This possibility fueled the belief that the Jesuits were more than missionaries. They were instruments, sharpened by discipline and ready to be wielded in any direction Rome chose. The vow remained largely hidden from the public, taken only by those who had endured years of training and testing. Yet its shadow fell over everything the order did, feeding suspicion that their reach extended far beyond the pulpit or the classroom. It became the seed of countless legends that painted them as the Vatican's most dangerous weapon, loyal not to nations but to a single voice in Rome. The structure of the society itself gave weight to these suspicions. Unlike other religious orders that lived in monasteries, the Jesuits were organized with almost military precision. At the top stood the superior general, often called the Black Pope, a man who held authority for life and whose word carried the force of command across continents. Beneath him were provincials, who oversaw vast regions, and rectors who managed individual colleges and missions. Every Jesuit reported to someone higher, and every action was written down in reports that moved steadily up the chain. This hierarchy gave the order a discipline unmatched in the Church, a a directive from the top, could ripple across the world with remarkable speed, obeyed without hesitation by men thousands of miles away. Outsiders saw in this structure something less like a brotherhood and more like an army, not of soldiers but of minds trained for strategy and obedience. The secrecy of their communications added to the aura of control. Letters were often written with coded phrases, layers of meaning known only to those inside. Reports appear like prayers or sermons, but carried hidden signals meant for their superiors. Even the clothing and gestures of Jesuits sometimes conveyed messages unseen by others. To the faithful, this system allowed the order to function efficiently and to respond wherever the church needed them. To skeptics, it looked like the skeleton of a hidden empire, governed not by elected councils or open debate, but by silent obedience to one man. Whether viewed as holy discipline or dangerous control, the design of the Jesuit order ensured they would always move with one voice, one purpose, and one hidden command. The figure of the superior general became the embodiment of both reverence and fear. He was not a pope in white robes blessing the crowds from balconies, nor a cardinal presiding in public councils. He remained largely unseen, operating in quiet rooms where decisions were made without spectacle. His authority extended across the world through men who answered only to him, and he was elected for life, making his role both permanent and powerful. Unlike monarchs who faced rebellions or parliaments who dealt with debate, the superior general was shielded by silence. His commands were framed as acts of devotion, and once given they were rarely questioned. This concentration of authority gave rise to the nickname the Black Pope, a title both symbolic and unsettling. It implied a second papacy, one hidden in shadow but equal in strength, if not in influence. Critics whispered that he controlled not only the Jesuits, but often shaped Vatican policy itself, sometimes even steering popes who outwardly led the church. None of these claims could ever be proven, but the very secrecy of the office fueled speculation. A man without a public face was harder to challenge, and his unseen hand could move across courts, schools, and missions without recognition. Admirers saw in him the ultimate servant of faith, guiding the order with discipline and humility. Opponents feared a strategist cloaked in black, holding threads of power that stretched farther than any crown or mitre. In truth, both images carried weight, for the superior general stood at the center of a system designed to be both spiritual and political, visible in deeds but invisible in intent. As the Jesuits expanded their presence, their schools became one of the most enduring instruments of influence. From their earliest days, they understood that to shape the future, one must first shape the young. They built colleges in the heart of cities, often attracting both the poor who showed promise and the wealthy whose families sought prestige. Their curriculum was broad and advanced, including philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, astronomy, and music alongside theology. Students trained under the Jesuits learned not only knowledge but discipline, order, and a way of thinking that emphasized precision and persuasion. Many of these students would grow into leaders of kingdoms, ministers in courts, generals, and judges. The Jesuit education gave them not only skills, but a worldview that subtly aligned with the values of their teachers. To parents and monarchs, the schools promised excellence. To critics, they looked like workshops of influence, where minds were molded not merely for faith, but for loyalty. Because the schools produced men of learning and confidence, they were respected across Europe, even by those who feared the order's power. Kings and nobles often sought Jesuit tutors for their children, believing them to be unmatched in rigor and refinement. Yet with each student shaped in Jesuit classrooms, the reach of the order stretched further. Ideas planted in youth often reappeared years later in policies, in councils, and on thrones. The Jesuits knew that an army of thinkers was stronger than an army of swords, and they wielded their schools as weapons more potent than steel. The quiet influence of education ensured their presence long after missions and political ties shifted, embedding their mark in the leaders of tomorrow. The effectiveness of Jesuit schools came not only from their subjects, but also from their methods. Unlike many educators of their time, the Jesuits emphasized debate, memory, and performance. Students were trained to think quickly, to speak with clarity, and to argue persuasively. They staged theatrical plays, not for entertainment alone, but as exercises in rhetoric and moral instruction. Each lesson carried both knowledge and strategy, weaving together faith and reason in ways that impressed even their rivals. Over time, their schools gained a reputation as the finest in Europe, producing alumni who would shape courts, universities, and armies. Yet such excellence stirred suspicion as well. Parents who once admired the rigor began to wonder what unseen influence guided the lessons. Critics claimed that Jesuit classrooms were less about learning and more about indoctrination, subtle training in loyalty that went beyond religion. Whether true or not, the suspicion clung to them. Governments recognized that a man who had passed through a Jesuit education carried a certain manner of thought, a disciplined logic, and often a quiet respect for the order. The more their schools flourished, the more people wondered what future leaders might carry hidden beneath their polished speeches. Were they simply better trained, or were they quietly guided by the hands that taught them? This question lingered, feeding the perception that Jesuit influence was not momentary, but generational. By teaching the minds of tomorrow, they seemed to control the shape of history itself, not with swords or decrees, but with chalk dust and whispered lessons inside a classroom. It was power both subtle and enduring, and perhaps their greatest weapon of all. Beyond the schools, the Jesuits also became renowned for their role as confessors to kings and queens. In the quiet of a confessional, rulers laid bare their fears, sins, and secrets, trusting the black-robed priest on the other side of the screen. Unlike ministers or courtiers, the confessor could not be bribed or threatened, at least not openly, and that made his presence both comforting and dangerous. The Jesuits who filled these roles were not chosen by accident. They were trained listeners, men skilled in psychology, language, and persuasion. They could guide a troubled monarch toward mercy or steer him toward decisive action, all under the cover of spiritual counsel. Critics began to ask unsettling questions. If a king trusted his Jesuit confessor more than his council, who truly held the reins of power? Was the advice given purely spiritual, or did it carry political weight as well? There were rumors of treaties signed, wars avoided, and policies reversed after a conversation whispered in the shadows of confession. No one could prove it, and the Jesuits themselves remained silent, bound by secrecy. Yet the pattern appeared too often to ignore. In moments of crisis, the hand of a Jesuit was rarely far away. Whether they were offering forgiveness or shaping decisions remained uncertain. That uncertainty was enough to unsettle entire courts. To some, their presence was divine guidance. To others, it was manipulation cloaked in holiness. Either way, the fact remained. In the most private chambers of Europe's rulers, Jesuits listened, and their influence reached into the hearts of those who shaped nations. It was this hidden role as confessors that fed one of the most persistent fears about the Jesuits. In a world where rulers held absolute authority, to know their secrets was to hold a power even greater than crowns. A whispered doubt, an unspoken fear, a private weakness could all be confessed in a moment of supposed safety. The Jesuit did not need to command armies or write laws. He only needed to know what others dared not say aloud. The very act of confession created dependence, binding ruler and priest in a cycle of guilt and forgiveness. Over time, the confessor became more than a listener. He became an unseen counselor, shaping choices from within the conscience itself. Critics asked if these conversations truly stayed within the booth, or if details traveled through the Jesuit network to Rome, to the superior general, to those who could use them strategically. The suspicion grew stronger whenever a monarch shifted policy suddenly after a season of private counsel. Those who feared the Jesuits saw this as proof of manipulation. Those who admired them saw it as a sign of divine wisdom guiding rulers through trusted advisors. The truth was elusive, for no record of such exchanges exists. What could be written down would betray the sacred seal, and yet the silence itself allowed legends to flourish. Whether or not the Jesuits wielded secrets as weapons, the perception that they might was enough to give them power. In the delicate courts of Europe, fear could be just as effective as proof, and the Jesuits thrived in that space between certainty and suspicion. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. As the Jesuit presence deepened in courts and kingdoms, whispers began to circulate that their influence reached far beyond confessionals and classrooms. They were often seen in places where decisions were made, yet they rarely held official titles. A Jesuit might serve as a tutor to a young prince, shaping his mind in youth and leaving a lasting mark that would emerge once the boy wore a crown. Another might act as an advisor in moments of political unrest, speaking quietly in chambers while armies marched outside. Their ability to move between roles without drawing attention gave rise to suspicion that they were less priests and more strategists, men who observed and influenced without appearing to rule. This suspicion grew sharper when the reports to Rome were considered. Letters carried from distant missions and courts did not focus only on baptisms or prayers. They contained careful notes on geography, trade routes, alliances, and weaknesses. Such knowledge, collected across continents, gave the Vatican a map of power that few monarchs could match. To those who trusted them, this was evidence of dedication, a sign of their loyalty to the Church's mission. To their enemies, it looked like espionage under the cloak of religion. Governments worried that Jesuits could sway policy not by threat, but by counsel, guiding rulers into decisions that suited Rome. The line between holy service and covert control blurred, and in the absence of clarity, suspicion hardened into fear. Wherever the Jesuits appeared, so too did rumors that their loyalty lay not with the nations they lived in, but with the unseen command of their order. The further the Jesuits spread, the more their missions began to resemble something greater than ordinary priestly work. In foreign lands, they learned languages with astonishing speed, mastering dialects that even traders struggled to grasp. They dressed as locals, ate the same food, and adopted the customs of the people they lived among. This ability to blend in made them invaluable as missionaries. but it also led to suspicion that their true purpose was not only to convert but to observe. Reports sent back to Rome were often filled with details of geography, natural resources, and the inner workings of foreign courts. A Jesuit in Asia might write not only about new baptisms, but also about celestial observations or the structure of an emperor's council. A Jesuit in the Americas could describe the terrain, the rivers, and the tribes in ways that explorers later found invaluable. Such information, gathered under the banner of faith, gave Rome a breadth of knowledge rivaling that of empires. To critics, it looked like a global intelligence network disguised as missions. Whether this was intentional or simply the byproduct of curious minds, the effect was the same. The Jesuits became known not just as priests but as recorders of the world, men whose notebooks could shape the strategies of kingdoms. And while many admire their brilliance, others fear that the order's reach was too wide, its influence too subtle, and its knowledge too dangerous to belong to one group alone. In China, the Jesuits gained prominence by presenting themselves not simply as preachers but as scholars. They brought with them knowledge of astronomy, cartography, and mechanics that impressed the imperial court. They helped reform calendars, advised on scientific matters, and introduced European instruments that seemed almost magical to those who had never seen them before. Their position as experts allowed them access few foreigners ever achieved. Yet, beneath their work in science and culture lay another layer of purpose. Every observation was carefully recorded, every custom noted, every political structure described in detail, and sent back across oceans to Rome. They were praised by some as bridges between civilizations, yet others saw them as agents who quietly studied kingdoms as if they were puzzles to be solved. Their closeness to emperors and ministers worried European rivals as well. Were they truly serving the faith, or were they quietly mapping the balance of power across Asia? The Jesuits themselves rarely answered such charges directly, choosing silence and steady work over public defense. That silence, however, allowed imaginations to fill the gap. To their supporters, they were noble missionaries adapting to new lands with respect and brilliance. To their critics, they were strategists, using science as a doorway into influence and control. Whatever the truth, their presence in China left a mark that lasted for generations, one that demonstrated how far the Jesuits were willing to go to gain both trust and knowledge. In the Americas, the Jesuits established missions that became known as reductions. These were organized settlements where indigenous communities were gathered together under Jesuit guidance. On the surface, they promised protection from slave traders, soldiers, and the chaos of colonial expansion. Inside, they provided farming methods, schools, and a structured way of life centered on the church. To admirers, the reductions were examples of order and safety in a dangerous world. To critics, they were cages, designed to strip away native culture and replace it with obedience to Rome. The Jesuits defended their work, claiming they were offering salvation and stability. But the truth was more complex. The missions became self-sufficient communities with their own defenses, trade networks, and strict rules enforced by Jesuit authority. Some saw this as evidence that the order was building a separate empire within an empire, a realm that did not answer to kings but to the superior general in distant Rome. These missions unsettled colonial officials who feared the Jesuits were more loyal to their own system than to the crowns that funded their ventures. Rebellions broke out, both from within and from outside. Yet the Jesuits always seemed to survive, their influence intact, even when villages were burned or abandoned. The reductions revealed how the Jesuits could embed themselves in new lands, not just as missionaries, but as rulers of carefully shaped communities, blurring the line between faith and control in a way that alarmed both allies and enemies. In Europe, their schools became their most enduring legacy. Unlike monasteries that focused on prayer and scripture alone, Jesuit colleges taught a wide range of subjects. Mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, literature, and rhetoric were placed alongside theology, creating an education that shaped not only priests, but also future rulers, diplomats, and scientists. Young nobles flocked to their classrooms, eager for the kind of training that prepared them for leadership. Parents trusted the Jesuits with their children, believing the order instilled discipline, intellect, and moral guidance. But there was more than simple learning taking place. Education became a tool of influence, a long game of shaping minds that would one day direct the course of nations. Those who graduated from Jesuit schools often carried with them a loyalty, conscious or not, to the order that had formed their early thinking. This raised questions among governments. Were these schools spreading faith alone, or were they subtly embedding a way of viewing the world that placed Rome above all else? Rival educators accused the Jesuits of indoctrination, while supporters praised their brilliance in raising leaders who were confident and eloquent. The truth may have been both. Through their schools, the Jesuits created an empire not of armies or borders, but of thought. The ideas planted in youthful minds bloomed years later in decisions made in courts and councils, and in that sense, their chalk and ink became sharper weapons than any blade, allowing influence to stretch quietly across generations. The success of Jesuit education stirred both admiration and fear, because it revealed how deeply the order understood the value of shaping the future. A classroom may have looked simple, with wooden desks, chalkboards, and rows of students, but within those walls, something far greater was happening. Young men learned not only the foundations of science and philosophy, but also discipline, obedience, and the art of persuasion. They were trained to speak with confidence, to argue with precision, and to see the world as a structured place where loyalty and order mattered above all. Over time, many of these students rose to positions of authority in government, the military, and even the church itself. Their decisions were guided by the lessons they absorbed as boys, lessons that carried the subtle imprint of Jesuit reasoning. Critics call this indoctrination, claiming the order was building an invisible empire of thought that stretched across courts and kingdoms. Supporters countered that it was the finest education available, producing men of intellect and character. The truth likely lay somewhere between, for the Jesuits knew that control of knowledge meant control of power. By teaching the young, they were not simply preparing them for life. They were planting ideas that would quietly shape the future course of nations, turning schools into unseen battlegrounds where the fate of empires might one day be decided. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. As the Jesuits grew in stature, their vow of obedience set them apart from every other religious order. Poverty and chastity were expected of monks and priests. But the fourth vow bound the Jesuits to the Pope in a way that was absolute. It was not simply loyalty in spirit, but a command to act without hesitation, wherever and whenever they were needed. If ordered to travel across the world, they would leave at once. If asked to serve in disguise within a royal court, they would obey without a word of complaint. This vow gave the Pope a powerful instrument, one that could move with speed and secrecy across continents. Yet it also gave rise to suspicion. For kings and rulers, the presence of men who answered not to local law but to a distant authority was troubling. A Jesuit confessor at a royal court might hear secrets that could be passed along to Rome. A Jesuit tutor might guide a prince toward decisions that favored the church over the crown. The line between service and espionage grew faint. To their allies, the vow was proof of unmatched dedication. To their critics, it was proof of dangerous control, for it created men willing to surrender their will entirely to another. In that surrender, the Jesuits became not only priests but tools of power, instruments of a system that could move silently and strike with precision whenever commanded. The structure of the order reflected the mind of its founder, who had once been a soldier before turning to faith. He built the Society of Jesus not like a monastery, but like an army. At the top stood the superior general, known in whispers as the Black Pope, a man who did not bless crowds from balconies, yet commanded unmatched obedience within the order. Beneath him, provincials oversaw regions, rectors directed colleges, and masters trained novices with relentless discipline. Each level reported upward, and every action was recorded in letters, evaluations, and reports. This system resembled a military chain of command, where decisions flowed downward and loyalty moved upward without interruption. Such structure ensured precision, but also secrecy. Orders were given quietly and carried out swiftly, leaving little trace for outsiders to follow. To governments, the organization appeared unsettling, for it resembled a hidden state within a state, operating with loyalty not to crown or nation, but to its own hierarchy. To supporters, it was a marvel of discipline, proof that men could live in unity of purpose without chaos. Yet this very discipline gave rise to endless rumors, for when an order functions so smoothly and silently, it becomes easy to believe it is capable of almost anything. The Jesuits themselves encouraged no such talk, but their silence often spoke louder than denial. The superior general, often called the Black Pope, held a position unlike any other in the church. While the Pope in white stood as the spiritual father of millions, the Black Pope commanded a disciplined network of men who reached into every corner of the known world. He was chosen for life, not by crowds or public acclaim, but by the inner circle of the order. Once elected, his authority was nearly absolute, extending across continents through coded letters and trusted messengers. Few outside the Jesuits even knew his face, yet his voice carried across oceans, directing missions, recalling agents, and shaping the strategies of the order. Some feared that his power rivaled that of the Pope himself, for while the pontiff navigated politics and public ceremony, the Black Pope worked in silence, unconcerned with appearances, focused only on efficiency and results. His authority made kings uneasy, for they saw in him a hidden ruler who commanded obedience without needing armies or crowns. Even within the church, whispers grew that the Jesuits might one day overshadow their master. But the superior general thrived in shadow, and his anonymity was his shield. While the world argued about who held true power in Rome, the Black Pope continued his work unseen, reminding all that authority can be most dangerous when it does not need recognition to be obeyed. The Jesuits mastered the art of information. Wherever they traveled, whether to the courts of Europe, the jungles of South America, or the palaces of Asia, they sent back detailed reports. These were not just records of baptisms or sermons, but precise descriptions of landscapes, trade routes, political tensions, and cultural practices. Each letter became part of a vast network of knowledge stored in Rome, giving the order insights that rivaled the intelligence of any kingdom. Their missionaries became observers as much as preachers, their role to blend into societies while quietly gathering details no one else could see. They learned languages with remarkable speed, adopted local customs, and often lived as insiders. To outsiders, it appeared as devotion to faith. To skeptics, it looked like espionage, cloaked in piety. Kings grew wary when they realized Jesuits often knew more about their courts than their own officials. This flow of knowledge made the Society of Jesus one of the most informed groups in the world, able to anticipate political shifts, economic changes, or brewing revolts. Power does not always lie in armies or gold, but in knowing what others do not. And the Jesuits wielded that power with subtle precision. Their silence protected them. For the less they explained, the more people imagined and often feared them capable of anything. Knowledge became their greatest weapon, but also their greatest source of suspicion. Jesuit reports were often written in layers, with passages that seemed like spiritual reflections yet contained hidden meaning for those trained to read them. What looked like a meditation on faith might also be a coded message about the strength of a kingdom's army or the mood of its rulers. The order's ability to communicate across great distances without detection made governments uneasy. They suspected that Jesuits carried secrets more valuable than treasure, passing information that could shape alliances or topple thrones. In truth, the line between missionary work and intelligence gathering blurred so much that many could no longer tell the difference. To the faithful, the Jesuits were servants of God, bringing light to distant lands. To rulers, they were men who listened too closely, remembered too much, and never forgot who they truly served. Their loyalty was not to any nation, but to their order, and through it, to Rome. That independence gave them freedom, but also marked them as dangerous. Some believed the Jesuits were the Church's invisible arm, reaching into places swords could not. Others saw them as spies in black robes, bending faith to gather power. The truth may never be known fully, but one certainty remains. Knowledge gave them reach far beyond what their numbers should have allowed, and in the silence of their letters, the Jesuits built an empire of information. The confessional became one of their most powerful tools, though it was never openly admitted. In the quiet of a chapel, behind a wooden screen, kings, queens, generals, and nobles laid bare their secrets. They confessed their fears, their ambitions, and their sins, believing their words, vanished into sacred silence. Yet the man listening was often a Jesuit, trained not only in theology but in psychology, memory, and strategy. To some, this was the purest form of guidance, a priest offering counsel to troubled souls. But to others, it looked like something far more dangerous. In those whispered moments, the Jesuits learned what few others could. They knew which rulers doubted Rome, which ministers planned rebellion, and which alliances trembled on the edge of collapse. This knowledge was not written down, yet it flowed quietly through the order, guiding decisions at the highest levels. Even if most Jesuits used confession solely for spiritual aid, the perception of influence was enough to unsettle kingdoms. The idea that the secrets of rulers could pass through the ears of men who owed their loyalty not to crown but to pope created an unease that never fully faded. Whether or not those secrets were ever used, The suspicion alone gave the Jesuits a kind of shadowy power that no army could match. Rumors began to spread that the Jesuits were not only listeners, but silent manipulators of events. When wars ended sooner than expected, or when unexpected alliances were formed, some claimed it was the result of whispered counsel given in confessionals or private chambers. A king who trusted his Jesuit advisor might change the course of a nation after a single conversation. A queen guided by her confessor might turn against her own ministers. These shifts often looked sudden to the outside world, as if history itself had bent in an unseen hand. Critics accused the society of shaping rulers to serve not their own people, but the interests of Rome. Defenders argued the opposite, insisting the Jesuits simply gave spiritual direction that rulers willingly followed. The truth was hard to pin down, for the Jesuits themselves rarely spoke publicly about their role. Their silence left others to imagine plots and schemes, and imagination often proved more powerful than fact. Every unexpected death of a noble, every strange turn in policy, every hidden alliance was eventually blamed on the men in black robes. Some of these stories may have been no more than fear given form, yet they endured, for they matched the secrecy of the order itself. Where silence exists, suspicion grows, and the Jesuits lived comfortably in that silence. As suspicion grew, monarchs across Europe began to look more closely at the presence of Jesuits in their courts. It became clear that the order's influence was not limited to religion, but extended into politics, education, and diplomacy. Jesuits served as confessors, tutors, and advisors, positions that gave them daily contact with the most powerful figures of the age. Their reputation for discipline and sharp intellect meant rulers often relied on them more than on their own ministers. This closeness, however, also bred unease. How could a king be sure that his Jesuit advisor was not reporting his secrets to Rome? How could a queen trust that her son's tutor was not shaping him toward loyalty to the Pope above all else? Over time, such questions hardened into accusations. Enemies of the society claimed that the Jesuits were playing both sides, guiding rulers while secretly supporting their rivals. Others insisted they were stoking unrest on purpose, creating chaos that only they could resolve. Though proof was scarce, patterns seemed to confirm the fears. The Jesuits were often present at turning points in history, yet their role remained hidden. They left no public record, no visible army, no banner to mark their presence. What they left instead was doubt. And for rulers already wary of betrayal, doubt was enough to mark the Jesuits as a dangerous force. Governments soon realized that Jesuits could not easily be controlled. Unlike other religious orders tied to local bishops or regional authority, the Jesuits answered only to their superior general. This meant that no king, no council, and no minister could claim their obedience. Their independence made them valuable allies but also unpredictable guests in royal courts. At times they seemed indispensable, solving disputes, guiding policies, and calming unrest with their influence. At other times, they appeared almost like a foreign power operating within the borders of a kingdom, loyal to no one but Rome. This unusual structure fueled the belief that the Jesuits were a state within a state, an invisible empire that stretched across continents. Their presence in schools, churches, and palaces only reinforced the idea. They could shape minds in classrooms, guide rulers in confessionals, and influence treaties in secret chambers. Monarchs who once welcomed them began to fear they had invited not just advisors, but rivals for control. And though the Jesuits themselves rarely sought open conflict, their quiet authority was enough to stir deep resentment. The question became unavoidable. How much power could one order hold before it threatened the balance of kingdoms themselves? The Jesuit structure mirrored that of a disciplined army rather than a monastic order. At the very top stood the superior general, often called the Black Pope, whose word carried absolute authority across the globe. Below him, provinces were managed by appointed leaders, each with precise instructions and the duty to oversee colleges, missions, and training houses. Every Jesuit was part of this chain, expected to obey orders without hesitation or debate. This strict discipline gave the society a strength unmatched by any other group in the Church. Decisions could be carried out quickly, and missions launched with astonishing coordination. Letters and reports flowed upward, creating a system of constant communication and control. To outside observers, it seemed as if the Jesuits were less priests than soldiers disguised in robes. The order's ability to act as one body under a single voice was both its greatest advantage and the source of its most dangerous reputation. Monarchs saw in them not simply servants of God, but a force that could rival their own authority. To some, the Jesuits represented loyalty to Rome above all else. To others, they appeared as a shadow army moving quietly across borders, bound not by national ties, but by a vow of obedience that seemed stronger than any oath of fealty. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. Training within the society was unlike anything most religious men endured. Candidates spent years in silence, meditation, and strict discipline. They were tested not only in faith, but in memory, logic, and obedience. A Jesuit in formation might be asked to endure hardship, to travel with little food, or to defend doctrine against skilled opponents. Every test was designed to prove loyalty and sharpen the mind. This was not simply preparation for the pulpit, but preparation for any circumstance the order might demand. By the time a man was fully accepted, he had been shaped into a tool of remarkable precision, able to teach, to advise, to persuade, or to vanish into a foreign culture without drawing suspicion. Such rigorous preparation made Jesuits stand apart. They were scholars and missionaries, but also observers and strategists. Their ability to adapt, to live as locals while serving a distant command, gave them a reach no one else could match. To the faithful, this showed their extraordinary devotion. To rulers, it looked like the making of perfect agents, men who could enter courts, blend into universities, and even step into the role of confidant to kings, all while carrying the mission of Rome in their hearts. As their presence spread, governments began to view the Jesuits with a mix of admiration and fear. In some places, they were celebrated for bringing education, building schools, and raising the level of scholarship. Their colleges produced men who became judges, diplomats, scientists, and advisors, all carrying the sharp reasoning and discipline taught by the order. Yet, the same success that earned them praise also planted suspicion. If Jesuit schools shaped the minds of future leaders, then what loyalties were being formed in those classrooms? Were these men being prepared to serve their nations or to serve Rome? Such questions grew louder as more rulers realized that many of their most trusted advisors had once been trained by the Society of Jesus. Enemies of the order began to accuse them of indoctrination, claiming that their education was not simply about knowledge, but about control. Whether true or not, the perception stuck. The Jesuits were not just priests or teachers. They were seen as engineers of thought, bending the beliefs of the next generation while smiling politely in the present. This quiet influence seemed almost invisible, yet its effects echoed in courts, councils, and even battlefields for centuries. The role of the Jesuits in science and learning only deepened the debate around them. While many religious groups resisted new discoveries, the society often embraced them, believing that all truth ultimately pointed to God. Jesuit scholars studied astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy, and in some cases, they stood at the front lines of discovery. They charted the stars with remarkable accuracy, corrected calendars, and contributed to early explorations of geography. Yet their curiosity sometimes brought them close to dangerous ground. Knowledge that challenged tradition had to be handled carefully, and the Jesuits became skilled at balancing what could be shared openly with what had to be kept hidden. Their writings were precise, layered, sometimes saying one thing to the public while hinting at deeper truths beneath the surface. This double voice only fueled suspicion that they were guarding knowledge not meant for ordinary eyes. Admirers praised them as enlightened men, advancing civilization through reason. Critics painted them as secretive manipulators who used science as another tool of influence. In truth, both views held some weight, for their brilliance was matched by a careful silence that kept others guessing about what the Jesuits truly knew and why they guarded it so closely. Confession was perhaps the most subtle and controversial tool of Jesuit influence. In royal courts across Europe, kings and queens entrusted their innermost fears and sins to priests, and often those priests wore the black robes of the society. The confessional was supposed to be a sacred place of forgiveness, yet it also became a channel of knowledge. A monarch might reveal doubts about an ally, worries about a rebellion, or even plans for war, believing the words would vanish into silence. But a Jesuit confessor was not an ordinary priest. He had been trained to listen with precision, to remember every detail, and to recognize the political weight of each word. Critics claimed that these secrets did not always remain sealed, that they traveled quietly through the Jesuit network to Rome. If true, it gave the society unparalleled access to the hearts and minds of rulers, knowing not only what they did, but what they feared. To some, this made the Jesuits indispensable guides, trusted voices of conscience. To others, it made them spies cloaked in holiness. The line between spiritual guidance and political influence blurred, leaving a trail of unease that stretched across kingdoms. Rumors of darker methods began to spread wherever Jesuit influence reached. Whispers told of sudden deaths, advisors who fell ill without warning, or rulers who changed their course of action after private conversations that no one else heard. These stories were never proven, but their persistence was enough to stain the order's reputation. Poison became the most common accusation. Tasteless, odorless, and nearly impossible to detect in those times, it was the perfect weapon for men who wished to leave no trace. Some claimed Jesuit-trained chemists had mastered rare compounds that could mimic natural illness. Others spoke of forged letters and hidden documents designed to topple a rival without a single drop of blood spilled. Whether true or imagined, such tales made enemies wary. Every sudden death near a Jesuit raised suspicion. Every unexplained shift in loyalty was seen as proof of manipulation. To defenders, these were nothing more than slanders spread by jealous rivals. To critics, they were the signs of a hidden hand shaping the fate of nations. And because the Jesuits themselves rarely responded to accusations, their silence only deepened the mystery. By the time their influence stretched across continents, the Jesuits had become both admired and feared. Their missions reached distant lands, where they blended into cultures with uncanny skill. They learned languages in months, adopted local customs, and gained the trust of rulers far from Europe. Yet these missions were never just about spreading faith. Reports sent back to Rome contained not only stories of conversions, but detailed observations of politics, trade, geography, and resources. In effect, every Jesuit abroad became both a missionary and an intelligence gatherer. This stream of knowledge created one of the most extensive information networks in the world, giving the order a map of global power long before most nations had one. Admirers saw this as dedication, proof of their devotion to understanding creation and serving the church. Critics saw something more dangerous, a network of spies disguised as priests, collecting secrets under the cover of salvation. The truth likely fell somewhere between. But what could not be denied was the reach of their influence. Wherever power gathered, Jesuits were rarely far behind, watching, listening, and recording. The missions in distant lands became the most visible sign of Jesuit ambition, yet also the most controversial. When they entered new territories, they did not simply build churches and preach. They often immersed themselves completely, learning the language, dressing like locals, and even adopting aspects of native culture to gain trust. This made them far more effective than other missionaries, who remained foreign in manner and speech. Jesuits were welcomed into courts in Asia, where they impressed emperors with their mastery of mathematics, astronomy, and calendar reform. In South America, they organized reductions, villages where native peoples were gathered under strict rules, protected from some outside threats, but also cut off from their old traditions. To some historians, these were shelters of safety in dangerous times. To others, they were cages, where cultures were reshaped and identities slowly erased. Every mission, however, served more than one purpose. While saving souls was the stated goal, information flowed back to Europe in long letters, filled with details about rivers, resources, armies, and alliances. A map of the world was quietly being drawn, not by explorers alone, but by Jesuits with pens in hand and obedience in their hearts. This dual nature made them invaluable to Rome and suspicious to monarchs, who began to ask whether the society's first loyalty was to God or to its own hidden designs. As their influence spread into royal courts, the Jesuits found themselves in positions that no other order could match. They were often chosen as confessors, advisors, and tutors to kings and princes. These roles gave them daily access to the most powerful figures in Europe, not only guiding their spiritual lives, but also shaping their thoughts, decisions, and policies. The trust placed in them was immense, yet it was also dangerous. When a monarch relied on a Jesuit advisor more than his ministers, suspicions arose that decisions were being steered from behind the curtain. Rivals at court whispered of manipulation, claiming the Jesuits used the confessional to bend rulers toward Rome's will. Some ministers even feared that the fate of kingdoms was being decided not in councils, but in hushed conversations between a sovereign and his spiritual guide. To many rulers, however, the Jesuits were a blessing. They were educated, articulate, and incorruptible in ways that courtiers were not. They listened without demanding rewards, offering counsel that seemed grounded in reason and conscience. This very combination of trustworthiness and influence made them invaluable to some and deeply threatening to others. The line between holy guidance and political power grew thinner with every whispered word. The structure of the society itself made such influence possible. Unlike other religious groups that operated with looser hierarchies, the Jesuits were built with the precision of a military force. Every member answered to a superior, and orders moved down the chain without debate or delay. At the very top stood the superior general, a figure so powerful within the order that he became known as the Black Pope. His authority stretched across continents, guiding men who lived in palaces, universities, villages, and remote missions. Unlike the Pope in white, the Black Pope rarely appeared in public. His strength came not from spectacle but from silence, a hidden command that was obeyed without hesitation. This strict design ensured unity, but it also bred fear among outsiders. A system so disciplined could be admired for its efficiency, yet it also suggested secrecy and control. How could monarchs trust men whose true loyalty belonged to a superior they themselves never saw? The Jesuit hierarchy was both their greatest strength and their greatest source of suspicion. It allowed them to move like one body across the globe, but it also convinced their enemies that such unity must conceal hidden motives. When the Jesuits rose in influence, they inevitably created powerful enemies. Monarchs who once welcomed them into their courts began to see their presence as a threat. Ministers whispered that the order was manipulating royal decisions, that their loyalty was not to any crown but to Rome itself. In Portugal, Spain, and France, suspicion grew until it reached a breaking point. Governments accused the society of meddling in politics, stirring unrest, and even plotting against rulers. The Jesuits, who had once been admired as teachers and advisors, were suddenly painted as conspirators. Expulsions followed, schools were seized, and missions dissolved. The accusations were rarely proven, but the fear was real enough that nations chose exile over risk. For the order, these bans were devastating, yet not final. Their network was too wide, their influence too deeply rooted, to vanish entirely. Even when cast out, they adapted, surviving in hidden circles or under the protection of sympathetic rulers. Each expulsion only deepened the mystery, raising the question of whether the Jesuits were victims of slander or truly the hidden power their enemies described. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here. Subscribe. The suppression of the Jesuits marked one of the most dramatic moments in church history. Under pressure from several Catholic monarchs, the Pope issued a decree that dissolved the order entirely. Overnight, their schools were shut down, their missions abandoned, and their priests scattered. For many, it seemed as though the Society of Jesus had been erased. Yet history showed that this was only an illusion. In places like Russia and Prussia, the decree was not enforced, and the Jesuits quietly continued their work under the protection of rulers who valued their schools and knowledge more than they feared their influence. In secret, they trained new members, wrote new texts, and preserved their network. To the outside world, it looked as though the order had been broken. In reality, it was waiting, hidden beneath the surface, watching the tides of politics shift. Decades later, the society was restored, proving that even the most determined attempts to erase it could not succeed. Suppression had not destroyed the Jesuits. It had only taught them patience, resilience, and the power of silence. The restoration of the Jesuits after years of suppression was not a return born out of sentiment, but necessity. The world had changed during their absence, fractured by revolutions, wars, and new ideas that threatened to weaken the authority of the Catholic Church. When the society was brought back into existence, it did not reappear as something broken or diminished. It re-emerged with renewed clarity of purpose, sharper in its methods, and more cautious in its public image. The Jesuits understood that survival depended on adaptation. They no longer sought to stand in the full glare of royal courts, where suspicion had once destroyed them. Instead, they moved back into classrooms, seminaries, and missions, shaping future leaders quietly, carefully, and with the patience that had always been their hallmark. Their schools, which had once made them targets of envy and fear, became the foundation of their return. Education was the perfect mask, the acceptable face of influence. By teaching science, philosophy, theology, and rhetoric, they ensured that a new generation of rulers, priests, and thinkers would unknowingly carry the Jesuit way of reasoning into the heart of society. Even their enemies could not deny the quality of their instruction. Monarchs sent their sons to be educated by the very men their predecessors had once banished, proof that suspicion could never outweigh the value of a disciplined mind. In time, their restored influence spread, not by overt displays of power, but by the steady drip of ideas planted in classrooms and whispered in confessionals. The Jesuits had learned that control was not always gained through force or politics. Sometimes, the truest power lay in patience, in training others to see the world as they wished it seen. And so they returned, quieter, subtler, and perhaps even stronger than before, determined that the mistakes of their first rise would not be repeated. With their return, the Jesuits seemed determined to show the world that they were indispensable. They carefully rebuilt their reputation, not by seeking positions of political authority, but by presenting themselves as servants of education, science, and faith. Their schools expanded quickly, drawing students from across social classes. For the gifted poor, the Jesuits offered free instruction, a ladder out of obscurity. For the wealthy elite, they provided a refined education that rivaled anything Europe could offer. This dual system meant that no matter where their students came from, they carried with them a debt of gratitude, and with that gratitude came influence. The Jesuits knew that a boy shaped by their classrooms might one day grow into a general, a judge, or a minister. And when that day came, his memory of Jesuit teaching would linger, often guiding him even when he no longer wore their robes. Beyond the classroom, they continued their missionary work, but always with a new caution. The missions no longer sought glory, but stability. Reports still flowed back to Rome, filled with details about politics, resources, and movements in foreign lands. Yet the tone was quieter, less ambitious, as if the order had learned that visibility was a weakness. What had once been criticized as a shadow empire of influence was now cloaked under the mantle of humility and service. But beneath that surface, the same discipline remained, the same unity, the same readiness to act swiftly if called upon by the papacy. The world may have believed the Jesuits had softened, but in truth, they had simply become wiser, content to let their ideas work slowly over generations, rather than draw fire in a single lifetime. As the centuries moved forward, the Jesuits became deeply entangled with the great questions of science and discovery. Their scholars were among the first Europeans to study distant skies through telescopes, to map unfamiliar lands with precision, and to record the languages and customs of cultures previously unknown to the Western world. This curiosity was not casual. It was disciplined, methodical, and tied always to the larger mission of influence. To rulers and scientists alike, the Jesuits appeared as men of astonishing breadth, able to debate astronomy one moment and theology the next. They gained entry into royal courts not only as confessors, but also as intellectual companions, offering knowledge that was practical as well as spiritual. In China, they served emperors as astronomers and mathematicians. In the Americas, they recorded vast details about geography, plants, and peoples. In Europe, they contributed to the debates that would shape modern science. Yet this pursuit of knowledge raised its own suspicions. How much did they truly share, and how much did they keep hidden for themselves or for the Vatican? Some argued that the Jesuits used science as a cover for gathering intelligence, that their reports on eclipses, rivers, and minerals were less about curiosity and more about strategy. Whether this was true or not, their ability to combine faith with learning gave them a unique power. They could speak to kings in the language of reason and to peasants in the language of devotion, shaping both in ways that suited the Church's long game. It was this dual mastery, science and scripture, logic, and faith that made the Jesuits unlike any other order and ensured that even when attacked, they remained necessary. The Jesuits' mastery of language became one of their most enduring tools. From their earliest days, they trained themselves to learn foreign tongues with remarkable speed, often becoming fluent in dialects that baffled other Europeans. This was no small feat, for language is not only words but also culture, memory, and identity. By speaking as the locals spoke, the Jesuits earned trust where outsiders were often viewed with suspicion. In Japan, they presented themselves as scholars. In India, they debated philosophy with Hindu sages. In China, they translated religious texts into Mandarin while studying ancient Confucian classics. Each effort was more than an attempt at conversion. It was an act of listening, of observation, and of influence. The reports they sent back were filled with details not just about the language, but about the customs, beliefs, and politics of each society. These were not mere travel journals. They were intelligence documents, carefully crafted to inform decisions in Rome. What made this extraordinary was the dual image they maintained. To the people they lived among, they seemed like humble priests, eager to learn and share. Yet to the Vatican, they were trained observers mapping the inner workings of empires. In this way, the Jesuits created bridges where others saw barriers. Language became both their mask and their weapon. Through it, they gained entry to courts, palaces, and councils where secrets were spoken more freely because the listener was thought to be a friend. Few realized that those words might travel thousands of miles, reshaping decisions in distant rooms of power. The role of the Jesuits as confessors to kings was perhaps their most subtle and yet most dangerous form of influence. In a time when rulers were surrounded by ministers, spies, and courtiers who all had their own agendas, the confessional stood apart as a place of absolute secrecy. Inside its wooden walls, a monarch was stripped of power, forced to admit sins and weaknesses to a priest sworn to silence. When that priest was a Jesuit, the stakes became far greater. Every whispered fear, every hidden guilt, every private doubt was heard by a man who had sworn not only to God, but also to the Pope. This dual loyalty created unease among rival advisors. How much of what a king confessed in sorrow or shame was later used to shape his decisions? Some claimed entire policies had been shifted by the quiet guidance of Jesuit confessors. Wars ended, treaties broken, rivals disgraced, all seemingly after a sovereign sought counsel in the booth. The Jesuits insisted they acted only as spiritual guides, yet the suspicion never faded. For a ruler, the confessional was not simply a place of forgiveness. It was a moment of vulnerability, one that could tilt the balance of power if the listener chose to act upon it. And though no proof ever surfaced that secrets were deliberately passed along, the fear was enough to create enemies everywhere the Jesuits served. To their supporters, they were men of faith protecting rulers from sin. To their critics, they were spies with access to the deepest chambers of the human soul. As Europe entered an age of constant upheaval, the Jesuits found themselves both praised as protectors of the faith and accused as agents of hidden power. Their reputation became a double-edged sword. On one side, they were admired for their intellect, their discipline, and their ability to navigate treacherous political landscapes without open conflict. On the other, their silence, their networks, and their uncanny ability to reappear where decisions were made fueled suspicion. Monarchs who once welcomed them into their courts grew uneasy, sensing that their advisors might serve Rome's interests before their own. Rivals accused them of controlling too much information, of knowing secrets that no priest should ever know. The Jesuits deny these charges, but their very structure made denial difficult to believe. Their obedience to the superior general, their tight communication system, and their talent for moving undetected across borders gave them an aura of conspiracy. When wars broke out or alliances shifted unexpectedly, whispers pointed to the Jesuits as hidden instigators, though proof was rarely found. This climate of fear reached a point where even their brilliance became threatening. Their schools produced men who seemed always to rise quickly. Their missions gathered knowledge that kings envied, and their confessors held sway in places where armies could not reach. To some, this was evidence of divine blessing. To others, it was proof of a dangerous shadow order. The truth likely lay between admiration and paranoia, but by then, perception had become reality, and perception alone was enough to make them one of the most feared groups in Europe. When opposition reached its peak, entire nations turned against the Jesuits, driving them out with decrees that accused them of political manipulation and secret plots. In Portugal, France, and Spain, rulers declared that the order had grown too powerful, too independent, and too dangerous to tolerate. Their schools were seized, their missions dismantled, and their members scattered. Yet even in exile, the Jesuits displayed a resilience that set them apart. They adapted quickly, finding shelter in lands where their presence was tolerated, and continuing their work quietly beneath the surface. Some disguised themselves within other orders, others traveled farther afield, and many continued to write, teach, and advise under different names. This ability to vanish without vanishing became one of their defining traits. Enemies thought they had ended the society, but in truth, it had simply gone underground. In Russia, rulers valued their knowledge too much to suppress them, and in Prussia, their schools continued with little interruption. The attempt to raise the Jesuits, only proved how deeply they had embedded themselves into the intellectual and spiritual fabric of the world. Even without official recognition, their ideas lived on through the minds they had trained and the books they had written. Their suppression revealed the paradox at the heart of their story. They were feared precisely because they were effective, mistrusted precisely because they were loyal to a power beyond kings, and yet always needed for the very qualities that made them suspect. In trying to silence them, their enemies only gave proof of their enduring influence. The restoration of the Jesuits after years of suppression was not a loud triumph, but a quiet return. Where others might have emerged with bitterness or vengeance, the society came back with patience and subtlety. Their old structures were rebuilt, but this time with lessons learned. They avoided open displays of influence, choosing instead to let their schools, writings, and networks speak for them. The church welcomed them back because, despite fear and suspicion, it could not do without their skill. They had shaped generations of priests, trained diplomats, guided rulers, and maintained a network of knowledge that stretched across continents. To lose such a system permanently would have been a loss too great, even for those who doubted them. And so the Jesuits returned, stronger than before, sharper in their awareness of what it meant to be both essential and mistrusted. They understood that power did not need to be declared to be real. It only needed to be applied at the right time, in the right place, through the right words. Their survival proved their adaptability. Suppression could scatter their bodies, but it could not erase the ideas they carried or the methods they had perfected. They had been built for endurance, for silence, for influence that could withstand exile and return with greater strength. Their enemies had hoped to bury them, yet all they had done was give the Jesuits another layer of mystery, another legend to add to their already formidable reputation. The story of the Jesuits does not end with their return, nor does it remain confined to the centuries of suppression and restoration. Their influence continued to ripple outward, shaping not only the church, but also the wider world in ways that remain hard to trace, yet impossible to ignore. From the moment they were restored, their schools once again became magnets for the brightest minds of the age. These institutions did more than educate. They cultivated ways of thinking, instilling discipline, order, and the ability to argue with precision and eloquence. Students trained in Jesuit classrooms often rose to high office, not because the order demanded it, but because their formation prepared them to lead. Judges, ministers, generals, even future popes were shaped by lessons that blurred the line between knowledge and obedience. The Jesuits understood that power is most enduring when planted like a seed. A boy sitting at a desk in one of their schools could grow into a man who carried their worldview into courtrooms, councils, or palaces. This influence required no armies, no banners, only the steady shaping of the mind. Yet education was only one strand of their enduring presence. The Jesuits also re-entered the political and spiritual currents of the modern world. They advised rulers as they had done before, though often in subtler ways. They traveled as missionaries, not merely to convert, but to observe, to learn, and to record. The letters they sent back continue to feed into a vast network of knowledge. Geography, languages, commerce, and political tensions flowed quietly through their reports. Their work looked holy, but beneath it was always strategy. Some saw this as loyalty to the faith. Others feared it was loyalty to something more elusive, a hidden plan known only to their leaders. Whatever the truth, their adaptability meant they always seemed to fit into the moment. When empires rose, they served. When empires collapsed, they adjusted. When revolutions broke apart nations, they found ways to survive, slipping into the cracks left by chaos. Their structure remained their greatest strength. The vow of obedience still bound them to the Pope, yet within their order, the superior general remained the hidden commander. This man, often unseen by the public, guided the Jesuits with a firmness that reminded some of a general rather than a priest. Orders were followed without delay. Reports were written with precision. Silence was maintained as though it were the sharpest weapon. In a world growing louder, the Jesuits clung to quiet discipline, and that quietness only deepened their mystery. For centuries, their critics whispered that they were assassins, manipulators, or the shadow arm of the Vatican. But their defenders countered that they were scholars, teachers, and the most loyal servants of the faith. Both images persisted because both contained pieces of truth. They were men who could preach forgiveness in the morning and advise kings by night. They could translate scripture into forgotten languages while mapping the trade routes of empires. They were many things at once, and that complexity made them impossible to define. As time passed, their reputation as both saints and spies became part of their identity. They were celebrated for scientific contributions, discoveries, and writings that advanced human understanding. Yet they were also remembered for rumors of poison, forged letters, and whispered influence in the deaths of rulers and the suppression of ideas. The truth may never be fully known because the Jesuits thrived on the line between appearance and reality. They did not need to confirm or deny the accusations. Silence worked better. It allowed their legend to grow, making them larger than life, feared even where they were absent. To some, that silence was holiness. To others, it was proof of guilt. What remains undeniable is their survival. Orders have risen and vanished, but the Society of Jesus endures. Suppressed, restored, attacked, praised, they remain. Their endurance is not accidental. It is the result of design, patience, and an unwavering belief in their mission. Whether that mission was purely spiritual or also political is the question that has haunted their history. Were they truly the hidden killers of the Vatican, or were they simply misunderstood men who lived with a discipline that frightened the world? Perhaps the answer lies in both possibilities. Power is rarely clean, and faith is rarely simple. The Jesuits lived at the point where both meet. They were willing to endure suspicion, to be feared, to be hated, if it meant preserving what they believed was higher than themselves. And so their story remains a shadow on history's wall. They were never crowned kings, never wore armor, and rarely stood on public stages. Yet their presence is felt in decisions that shaped nations, in schools that molded leaders, in whispers that shifted the course of wars. The world remembers them not for one act, but for the strange mixture of brilliance and fear that followed them everywhere they went. They proved that silence can be as sharp as any sword, that memory can be a weapon, and that obedience, when absolute, can be both holy and dangerous. The question of whether the Jesuits were the Vatican's hidden killers will never be answered in full, but perhaps the better truth is this. They understood how to move through history unseen, and that is what makes them unforgettable. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.